Well, good afternoon, everybody. Our numbers seem to be leveling out, so we'll start. Welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming this afternoon to the first in our series of webinars for those new or returning to the Higher Educationist Students Early Statistics Survey, HESES, as it is known. My name is Roger Lear. I'm a funding officer here at the Office of Students, the OfS. And our session today will outline how the funding cycle works and particularly how this relates to HESES data. But as usual, first of all, we need to do a little bit of webinar housekeeping. So if my link goes down, my colleague Will Alwood will step in to take over from me, and my colleague Graham Price will join us later on to respond to your questions. We've turned on the live transcription feature in Zoom, so captions are available by clicking on the CC icon. Unfortunately, these don't handle our jargon terribly well, so if you see something which doesn't appear to make sense, then that's probably why. Sorry about that. The event is being recorded and it will be up on our YouTube channel before too long after the event, and you'll be able to find the link to that via the events page on our website, and in a few minutes I will just show you a link where you can which you can use to get to that. So the intended audience today is pretty much those who've not come across HESES before, or those wanting a refresher. I should at this point also thank those who submitted questions when they signed up for the webinars. You can continue to submit questions to us today at any time, and we'll take a break a couple of times as we go through the session to look at those, and then again when we finish. To do this, to give us questions, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom rather than the chat feature, because that should only be used to contact our events team supporting the webinar if you need to. Now, we're scheduled to go for 90 minutes today. Of course, if we can finish early, then we will. And for those of you who have agreed to receive an evaluation form, then we will be sending that out after all of these events have concluded. But in the meantime, if you've got any feedback you'd like to give us, then again, I'll show you an email address in a couple of slides' time, which you can use to do that. So let's take a quick look at where this session fits into the program. Last week, we had a session for those that already have some knowledge and experience of HESES. You can watch that back if you think it would be useful to you. And again, the link is just around the corner. For those that are new to HESES, though, I think you'll find this session and those to come over the next couple of weeks to be useful. So this is the one we're at today, Introduction to OfS Funding and HESES24. And then on Thursday, we've got one on categorizing your students using the definitions. And then next week, we talk about identifying and counting those to be included in HESES24. And then on Thursday next week, we'll talk about getting HESES24 signed off, and we'll talk about multiplication factors. You can still sign up for these, or if you want to review the recordings, then the place to go is officeforstudents.org.uk/events. I will read all these links and addresses because I know there are some people who rely just on the audio for these sessions. And as we go, I'll also highlight landmark supporting materials here and there, and we'll revisit these before we conclude. But for an overview of OfS funding, the best place to go is definitely the Guide to Funding, which will see later on as we go. That's available on the OfS website at that horrendous URL. I won't read that. It might just be easier for you to go to our website and search for its publication number, OfS2024.35, or just Guide to Funding, and that should find the latest version of it. The best place to start for HESES resources is the main HESES page on the OfS website, which is at officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, HESES. And I'm going to put in a plug here for our email alert service. This is a really valuable thing which you can use to catch up not only on funding matters, but also other OfS announcements. It's officeforstudents.org.uk/sign up for email alerts, or hyphenated. So today we're going to look at three main areas. First, we're going to talk about OfS funding, looking at our regulatory and strategic objectives, funding objectives, the types of funding that we do and what that can be used for, and an outline of what we call the funding cycle. And then We're going to look at how student data, like HESES, is collected and how it's used to inform funding allocations. And then finally, we'll provide an overview of the HESES survey itself, including a look at the timetable for HESES24. And as I mentioned at the start, HESES, HESES, stands for the Higher Education Students Early Statistics Survey. It's annual, so this year we'll be recording data on students in 2024-25. So the survey we refer to as HESES24 for short. Okay, I think that's all the housekeeping, and we've got our numbers still creeping up a little bit, but I think it's time for us to get stuck in. So we'll look at the first of those, and we'll start by looking at OfS funding more in the round at this stage. And at first, we'll consider the role of the OfS. So as you may know, the OfS is the independent regulator for higher education in England and was established by what's referred to as HERA, the Higher Education and Research Act of 2017. Our aim, as it says here, is to ensure that every student, whatever their background, has a fulfilling experience of higher education that enriches their lives and careers. And our work covers all students, and we've listed various groupings here: undergraduate and postgraduate, young or mature, full or part-time, those studying on campus or by distance learning, which is increasingly popular, of course, and regardless of nationality. And it should be said that not all students will be counted towards our distribution of funding, and we'll see more about that idea as we go on. Funding is one of the regulatory levers, if you like, that the OfS can use to influence the higher education sector. Every year, the government provides the OfS with a fixed budget that we are empowered to distribute to higher education providers. It's worth exploring what this means. First, our funding is used to support the teaching activity of providers. We don't fund individual students. We don't provide funding to all higher education providers. To receive our funding, providers need to be registered with the OfS in what's called the approved fee cap category of the OfS register. So for the academic year 2024-25, this is going to amount to approximately 340 providers. It's also important to note that the funding we provide is separate to the income that providers get through tuition fees. OfS funding is designed to supplement tuition fee income by supporting subjects which have particularly high teaching costs, particular policy areas, and government priorities such as promoting equal opportunities. To receive our funding for a particular year, there are some specific criteria that apply. For instance, providers must be offering courses that meet our definition of recognised higher education, and we'll explore that later in the next webinar. But to give you an idea of the scale of our funding allocations, we are distributing around £1.4 billion in what we call recurrent funding for the 24-25 academic year. And we've also been distributing a total of £450 million of capital funding over the 3 financial years. You can see there, 2022-23 to 2024-25. And we'll touch on this briefly in a moment or two. As we mentioned earlier, OfS funding is one of the regulatory levers that the OfS can pull, and in the context of the OfS's approach and objectives on funding, it's worth quoting from the Guide to Funding, which I mentioned earlier. And it says, our funding helps to ensure the availability of high quality, cost-effective higher education across the country, and we promote quality of provision and greater choice and opportunities for students by investing in high-cost subjects at undergraduate, postgraduate levels, including medicine, science, engineering and agriculture, and other strategically important subjects, world-leading specialist providers, and part-time provision and other flexible modes of delivery. Our funding also enables students to access higher education and to successfully achieve their goals. And again, it's worth quoting from the Guide to Funding. We want students from disadvantaged backgrounds, underrepresented groups, and those with disabilities not only to access higher education, but also to achieve successful outcomes, including progression to postgraduate study. So with our funding objectives in mind, let's begin looking at the annual cycle of funding. And we'll do this by flagging 4 pieces of documentation that are published each year. They're key to this cycle, which we refer to as the funding round. So these 4 pieces of documentation I'm referring to are the government guidance letter that we get each year, our decisions on funding, the terms and conditions of funding, and our guide to funding, which I've already mentioned. We'll look at each of these in turn now and see how they link together as we progress through the funding cycle. And we can start this process by first asking, where does the OfS get the money that it distributes to higher education providers? Well, our funding comes from the government, as we mentioned, and this is outlined in a guidance letter from the Secretary of State for Education that we receive early each year. I've said there in the first quarter of the calendar year. This year was actually just into April. But you can find this on our website. Just search for guidance from government, and you'll see not just this, but all the other guidance that we get. This letter sets out the funds available to the OfS for the upcoming financial year, and it details the budgets for recurrent and capital funding, and it also sets out guidance on the government's priority policy areas. And it's also worth noting that the Department for Education can apply statutory conditions on our use of their funding, and they did in certain aspects of 24-25, as you will see if you have a look at that letter. So the next step is confirmation of our funding methods for the forthcoming year. And if there are significant changes to these, we might hold a consultation to the prior to the OfS board taking their funding decisions for the year. Now, it doesn't happen every year. It depends on the size of any changes, and there wasn't the need for that in 2024-25. Once the board has taken their decisions, we publish the second of the 4 documents that I mentioned, funding for the academic year 2024-25. There it is. This describes the board's funding decisions, which are taken in light of the various factors that I've got here, the budgets available, the guidance, which we just talked about, any statutory conditions which might have been imposed, and our general duties as set out in the Higher Education and Research Act, HERA, that we mentioned at the start, and our public sector equality duties. These are set out in the Equality Act of 2010. We also publish details of the terms and conditions under which we make funds available to providers, and this can also be found on our website. Providers are largely able to decide for themselves how they use their OfS funding. Our terms and conditions of funding that providers says their providers are free to distribute internally at their own discretion all funding from the OfS which is not earmarked or provided for a specific purpose. So as long as this is for the primary benefit of higher education courses and current and prospective students, that's okay. We do not specify, for example, that a given university must spend X £1,000 on teaching chemistry and Y £1,000 on teaching law. But there are, however, some earmarked funds which do have further conditions placed on them. So as an example, capital funding, where the funding must be used within the financial year for which it's supplied, and it must be spent on facilities and projects that support and improve a provider's teaching infrastructure. So other examples include student premium funding, very high cost STEM subject funding, and those allocated via challenge competitions. The terms and conditions document for each of those will have details. The last in this quartet of documents is the guide to funding, which already you'll have heard me mention. You can find that on the OfS website. As I say, search for its publication number 2024.35 or just search guide to funding. This is the best document for getting a comprehensive view of the OfS funding model. Here you'll find detailed descriptions of the methods that we use, the main elements being for recurrent funding, which makes up the large majority of the money that the OfS distributes each year. And it's mainly allocated by formula, as you can see, and provides funding that supports high-cost teaching, as well as strategically important subjects and policies. So then capital funding, which is allocated separately, and we'll have a quick look at that in a moment. And then we also contribute to the funding of certain national facilities and regulatory initiatives. This includes things like challenge competitions, which I just mentioned. These are bidding exercises that support projects in specific areas, and they're run as needed. And in the past, we've done things, for example, which support local graduates and look into student mental health and the development of flexible short courses. We also provide funding for facilities such as the National Student Survey and JISC, who are the UK's digital data and technology agency for the tertiary education sector. We won't explore any of these any further here, so please see the guide to funding for more details. Now, before we look at recurrent funding more closely, let's talk briefly about capital funding. This is allocated on a financial year basis, that is to say, for the year running between April and March in each calendar year. Now, in March 2022, the government's guidance letter set out the £450 million in capital funds available to us for what was then the next 3 financial years, 2022 to 23 and 2024 to 25. And we allocated this capital funding as follows. The bulk of it was allocated after a bidding exercise, just under £400 million, and that concluded in 2022. A small part of the total has been allocated by formula based on student numbers reported in HESES. And all approved fee cap providers were eligible for this allocation, although not all received funding because there was a minimum threshold applied to the formula. And some of these funds were used to support capital expenditure by JISC, who just got to mention there. So we're coming to the end of the current arrangements, but those for future years have not been decided. At the moment, we expect further guidance on this as we move towards 2025, 26 and beyond. If you want to look into details of the capital funding, please see the relevant pages and the address here. I will read this, officeofstudents.org.uk/for-providers/finance and funding/capital funding, and everything there. All of those words are hyphenated. Okay. By contrast, recurrent funding is allocated on an academic year basis, which is to say the period between the 1st of August and the 31st of July. It's divided up into a number of funding streams, which we will look at on the next slide. Recurrent funding, as I say, is primarily made through formula allocations, and HESES student data is one of the factors used in calculating this. We use HESES data for 1 year to inform the calculation of funding allocations for the next academic year. And this way, we can use the most recent student numbers to inform our funding allocations. So, for example, the data that providers return in HESES24 will be based on their student numbers for 2024-25, and these will be used in calculating the recurrent funding allocation for the academic year 2025-26. Current funding allocations are usually made in the summer prior to the start of the new academic year, and then the process starts again, giving rise to this expression, the funding cycle. So before we look at that more closely, as promised, let's look at the different elements which make up the recurrent grant. Our recurrent funding is provided through 3 main elements. So we've got funding for high-cost courses, for student access and success, and for specialist providers. So the first of these high-cost courses, you can see the figures there, just over £1 billion. This represents the largest part of our recurrent funding, and it recognises the extra costs associated with teaching certain subjects, and it provides support for the priority policy areas such as healthcare and accelerated courses. Funding for student access and success, just over £301 million, helps providers meet the costs involved in ensuring successful outcomes for students who belong to groups that are underrepresented in higher education or who need additional support. We also provide funding to help students in the transition into higher education. And then we've got £58 million here, which is funding for specialist providers. This goes to a small number of providers who have been identified as world-leading specialists in their field. So now let's draw all of the components that we've looked at so far in a high-level view of the funding round. So this diagram brings these concepts together, but looked at through the lens of recurrent funding. So one thing to note about this diagram is that the dates I've put in are approximate and tend to vary slightly from year to year, depending on what's going on. You could almost start anywhere here, but we'll start at the top. With the government guidance letter, which we talked about earlier, and this usually arrives, as I said, in the early part of the calendar year. And once we have that, we start to review our funding methods, and as I said earlier, if necessary, consult on any major changes. The OfS board and senior management will then take those funding decisions we talked about, and the terms and conditions document gets published. And having finalized our funding methods, we then use the latest available figures in calculating funding allocations for the upcoming academic year. So this is where HESES data comes into play, as well as individualized student data that each provider has submitted either to the designated data body or to the ESFA, the skills agency, part of the DFE. We'll talk more about these again shortly, because many in the audience, I'm guessing, will work on both sets of figures. And the culmination of these activities is the publication of our recurrent funding allocations in the summer prior to the start of the academic year. So as we move into the autumn, which at the time of this session is about here, providers will be finalizing submissions of their individualized data for the academic year that's just ended to the appropriate body. And that data will get used on the following lap of this cycle at about 6 o'clock mark, when we do the next academic year's funding allocations. Now, this is part of what we're doing now. The OfS is starting to release guidance and training materials for HESES data gathering and verification. And again, once data gathering has been completed and signed off, that data will feed into next year's calculations. And as the new calendar year begins, we will be looking ahead even further to the next year when we receive the guidance letter from the DFE. So the cycle goes on. Worth taking a little time here to just talk about the teams involved in the work that we've been looking at here. The funding round is overseen by the OfS funding team, and we administer the funding process itself. And we'll talk more about that on the next slide. We also have responsibility for developing and advising our senior colleagues on funding policy within the OfS. We also work closely with colleagues in government and other funding bodies and those who might be interested, and I've listed some of them here. The main ones, DFE, Department for Education, and other bodies with funding interests, notably NHS England, the Department of Health and Social Care, and the various medical and dental councils, JISC again, and Research England. So the administration of the funding round is actually split within the OfS between two directorates. Those of us in the regulation directorate determine the amounts due to providers under the funding model, and we're responsible for policy and for communications with providers. So we're the ones you're most likely to talk to if you have questions on your funding. In terms of recurrent funding, we run the HESES collection of data, and we apply formulae to allocate funds to those providers based on this and other data. Something similar happens for capital funding allocations, as well as the assessment of bids and the monitoring and allocation throughout the period of the grants for those. Likewise, other funding streams that we've mentioned, notably challenge competitions and the funding for specialist providers. Our colleagues in the Data Foresight and Analysis Directorate are responsible for the systems and calculations funding that we use. They run the computer systems that collect HESES and maintain the models, and they do all the calculation and analysis work that underlies our funding allocations and policy proposals. So it's worth noting as well that the funding team are not involved in actually paying providers their funding allocations. This is one of the roles that is done by our colleagues in the OfS finance team. If you're interested in the scheduling or profiling, as they say, of your grant payments, this is the team that are best placed to help you. In fact, there's a lot of information on the OfS portal at the address shown, https://extranet.officeforstudents.org.uk/grant report, all one word. But you can also email them on general finance queries at officeforstudents.org.uk. That's the best place to ask questions about scheduling and profiling of your payments. Okay, before we focus more on HESES, let me recommend the funding section of the OfS website, whose URL is here. office-for-students.org.uk/for-providers/finance and funding. And again, all those last bits are hyphenated. And as noted earlier, definitely the best place to get a good overview of all of this is the guide to funding. Just go to our website and search for those words and you should find it. So that's quite a lot to take in. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Graham Price, to go through any questions which have come in so far. And remember, if you're submitting questions, please use the Q&A function of Zoom to do that and reserve the chat for any necessary queries to the immense support team. So Graham, are you there?
I am indeed. At the moment, we haven't had any submitted live during the webinar as yet. We had a few submitted ahead of the webinar. Collectively, a few of them were looking for an overview of various aspects. So hopefully those will be covered within this webinar so far and with what's to come and the remaining 3 webinars. So a reminder, if you haven't already, to book up on those and come along. And obviously after the events, the team will be available on the various emails that are being provided throughout the presentations. And we had one other question, which was with regards to funding for accelerated programs. In particular, that one will be covered in the next webinar this Thursday, which covers categorizing students. Accelerated programs come under the long definition in HESES, which is Annex H. And obviously that feeds through into the funding allocations, which is set out a bit more in the guide to funding that my colleague Roger mentioned earlier in this presentation. But again, more on long years in Thursday's webinar. So book up and come along to that one. That's all we've got for now. We've got another Q&A session later, so we'll pick up any questions we may have had by then in that session.
Okay, thank you, Graham. And actually, yes, this is what always happens. As I sign on again to resume, I see that we have actually had a question in Q&A. So I won't look at that now, but I'll let you look at that and you can pick that up next time around. So thank you. Please keep those questions coming. Good. Okay, so let's move on. The final part of what we're going to look at today, probably the biggest part, is specifically to introduce HESES24 and how it relates to funding. So as I said earlier, most of our funding is formulaic and it's informed by student data, of which we use 2 types: aggregated data and individualized data. So HESES is the source of our aggregate data. It's used, as you've seen, for both recurrent and capital funding. And we are effectively using HESES data as a proxy that allows us to assess how much teaching activity is going on at each provider. It's the teaching activity that we're funding, not individual students. So it's important that we get accurate HESES data, and this allows us to make our funding allocations as fair and as accurate as possible. We also publish HESES as an official statistic, so it can be used by anyone from across the sector and the public more widely to look at student numbers. HESES data looks at the whole of your student body and categorizes it in certain ways, such as whether the students are full or part-time, undergraduate, postgraduate, and so on. And we look at how we do this in our next webinar. We also use other data sources to inform certain aspects of our funding allocations. In particular, we use the latest available individualized student data. So this provides information on the characteristics of your student body that we can't get from HESES. For example, age or typical entry qualifications. And this data is used to inform allocations for funding for student access and success. You remember that was one of the 3 elements to a recurrent grant that I just talked about. This is data that is reported to either the Education and Skills Funding Agency, the ESFA, via what's called the ILR, or to the designated data body, which is to say JISC for all other providers. Okay, coming back to HESES, let's address the issue of who completes HESES. HESES must be completed by providers that are registered with the OfS in the approved fee cap category. We touched on that earlier. those that have students registered with them for the current academic year or expect to have such students starting before the end of the academic year. And those that have students on courses that meet the definition of higher education recognised for OfS funding purposes. Now, this definition is given in the main HESES guidance, and we'll discuss this in our next webinar. When a provider doesn't have registered students in the current academic year, but is expecting to have them in the following academic year, we will ask for the submission of a data return called HESEF, the Higher Education Students Forecast, instead of HESES. Now, if you think this applies to you, please contact us. It uses the same definitions as HESES, so the content of this series of webinars will still be relevant to those doing HESEF. But to be clear, providers only complete one of these surveys for any one academic year, and for almost all providers, this is going to be HESES, and that's what we'll refer to throughout this entire series of webinars. So let's sum up what we've learned about HESES so far. Completing HESES, the Education Students Early Statistics Data Survey, is a requirement of registration for providers in the approved fee cap category of the OfS register. It gives us an early indication of higher education students' numbers at a provider in the current academic year, and it's used to inform allocation of funds for the following academic year. Now, you'll be reporting on your whole student body, or at least the part of it that's doing higher education courses, and you will need to categorize these students in certain ways. For example, as I've said before, the numbers between those doing full-time versus part-time years, or number of undergraduate and postgraduate students, and so on. So the data for the HESES survey is gathered in a Microsoft Excel workbook. Now, this is just the title page, and this will be available in late October for you to download from the OfS portal. When it becomes available, we will mail all the student data contacts on our records to let them know. Now, student data contacts, as we refer to them, are the people that have been nominated by each provider as our primary points of contact for this type of thing, the HESES process in particular. You can, and you're advised to, if you can, nominate more than one student data contact. So please email us at HESES, HESES at officeforstudents.org.uk to arrange that. Let's talk about how to get your provider's copy of the workbook from the OfS portal. Now, the notification email that we send will have details on how to do this. So in preparation for that time, it's a good idea to make sure that you have access to the portal. Let's just look at this briefly now. So the portal homepage shown here is at https://extranet.officeforstudents.org.uk/data, slightly different from the portal address I gave earlier. The key thing to notice here is that user accounts at individual providers are set up and maintained locally by what we call a user administrator at each provider. So there's guidance on that web page address I've just given for those administrators to help them set all that kind of thing up. And you'll find additional documentation in Annex 1 to the HESES guidance when that's, well, it has been released. The main guidance has been released. The appendix is going to be released imminently. So you can find that via the HESES webpage, officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. Finally, when we get to the last webinar in this series called Getting HESES24 Signed Off and Multiplication Factors, we'll do a whole lot more on this subject. So let's outline the main points needed in order to complete HESES. So what you're going to need is you're going to need an understanding of the data you're being asked for. So the HESES definitions, which is what this series is all about. You're going to be able to identify and count students in those categories, and then, as I say, know how to submit your workbook, get it verified, and then signed off. And these points are really reflected in the training sessions that we've got. So categorizing your students will be what we talk about on Thursday. Next week, a week today, identifying and counting students to be included in HESES24. And then, as I say, the final webinar on a week on Thursday. If you're just learning about multiplication factors, which get mentioned in the title there, we'll come back to them shortly. But I should say, before we move on here, that if you can't make it to any of these sessions, then we are videoing all of these, so you'll be able to revisit the recording when you get the chance. Okay, for your calendar, let's consider the HESES timeline. Note that some of the key dates here vary according to the type of higher education provider involved. So that is to say between further education and sixth form colleges and academies, which we refer to as FECs, and everybody else. So further education colleges have an earlier submission schedule, and there are various historic reasons for this, but it's also reflecting the fact that they submit their individualized student data to the ESFA on a different schedule to other providers who submit to the designated data body. So there are 4 key dates that you will need to know when completing HESES, although the last of these may not be an issue for you. So let's look at these. So first of all, there's the census date, which is for further education colleges, 1st of November 2024, and for everybody else, the 1st of December. Next, the deadline for making an initial valid submission of your workbook is noon on the submission deadline. These are, for further education colleges, it's the 30th of November 2024, and for everybody else, the 11th of December. The sign-off deadline is the same for everybody. That's the 31st of January 2025. And then finally, something new this year, the incorporation into HESES, the HESES process of accepting representations on multiplication factors. Now, I mentioned those a moment ago, and as I said, because this is an introductory session, I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but they will be covered in the final webinar. But briefly, we introduced multiplication factors last year as a way of determining the full-time equivalent student numbers that we use for calculating recurrent grant allocations. Now, we recognize that because circumstances change over time, there may be instances in which that data should be modified. So last year, we ran a separate process by which providers could make representations to this effect if they wanted to. So this year, we're incorporating that process into HESES24, and you will see this reflected in this year's workbook. So more on that, as I say, in the last webinar. At this stage, all you need to know is that it's a date that you should note. It may be that you choose not to make representations, but if you do, we should receive them by the 14th of February, 2025. Okay, let me flesh out that timeline a little bit. The data verification phase begins after the relevant submission deadline passes, whichever that may be, and it culminates in the sign-off of each provider's HESES return by the deadline of the 31st of January. And during this time, we'll work with you to understand the nature and the context of any changes in your provision. This process helps us to ensure that we've got the best possible picture of your data so that our funding allocations can be as accurate as possible. Data verification may show up anomalies or errors in the data that may require changes to your return before it reaches sign-off. So our data verification specialist will assist you throughout this process. And as noted, it's all working towards the culmination of all the sign-offs being in by the end of January. We're going to go through this, as I say, in more detail a week on Thursday, and sign up for that if you haven't already on our events page. And just to reinforce what I was saying earlier, the multiplication factors part of this will be seen in this year's workbook, and if you need to make representations, they need to be in by the 14th of February 2025. Again, more detail in the final webinar, and that's the title of it there, and the link is here. That's right, officeforstudents.org.uk/events. Okay, so that's getting towards the end of things now. So today, I just want to recap what, at this point, I just want to recap what we've talked about. First of all, we looked at OfS funding through a sort of bird's eye view, looking at our regulatory and strategic funding objectives, types of funding, and what they can be used for, and an outline of the annual funding cycle. And next, we took a look at how student data like HESES is collected and how it's used to inform funding allocations. And we've just been having a quick look, an overview of the HESES survey itself, including a look at the timetable. In this section, we saw the glimpses of things that we're looking at in the remaining webinars in this series, classifying your students, counting them, getting your HESES return through verification to sign off. And we've touched on multiplication factors which we'll also be looking into in that final webinar. So I want to signpost some further information here. If you want to find out more before we get to the next set of webinars, the best place to start is the main HESES page, officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES. And there are a number of resources there. Notable among those is going to be the HESES guidance document, and we recommend that you download a copy of this to refer to. This was published yesterday, and I believe that we've got links from that page to the guidance, but if you don't see it, then you can just say officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES24, and that will take you to the right place. Another valuable tool is something called Completing the HESES24 Workbook. Now, this is a document which is very valuable, particularly if you have not experienced HESES before. What this does, I should say, this is published at the same time as we release the HESES workbook, so that's going to be late in October. And what it does is it goes through the HESES, each table, each sheet in the HESES workbook, row by row, column by column, and describes what needs to go into each of those places. So look out for that when it arrives. You'll also find on the main HESES page, when they're available, which should be imminently, model workbooks, which will give you an idea, give you a picture which you can equate all this theory into. Let's see what else we've got here. The main HESES page also links to the HESES training page, and this itself links, has details and links to the recordings of the slide of the sessions that we're doing this week, and we will also publish all the slides that we are using. And again, I'm going to advocate the email alert service, which is a great way of keeping up to date on things like deadlines and publications as they come out. And again, here's the address for that, officeforstudents.org.uk/sign up for email alerts, with all of that being hyphenated. If you have questions about any and all of this, you can get in touch with us on the HESES team at HESES at officeforstudents.org.uk. So please drop us a line, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. Speaking of questions, I think it's time to go back to Graham. I know there was at least one question, Graham, that I spotted just as soon as I picked up from you last time, but have we got anything else to talk about?
I had spotted that one too, but it came in just as I was ending the last session. The first question we had is about the counting and how the numbers feed through to the allocations. So asking about the HESES24 numbers feeding into the 25-26 allocations, and obviously if 25-26 student numbers are expected to be increasing, should they be reported in HESES24? In short, the answer is no. You only return the students starting in 24-25. This will be covered more in the next two webinars, particularly which cover the categorizing and counting numbers for HESES24. But effectively, the numbers in HESES24 flow through to the 25-26 allocations. And then if there are either an increase or a decrease in numbers in 25-26, which are reported in HESES25, that'll then flow through into the 26-27 allocations and so on. Again, though, these will be covered more in particular detail in the next two webinars. So if you haven't already registered to those, and it will be fully fleshed out in the webinars. And obviously after the webinars, if there are still questions, again, the emails that we've provided throughout these sessions, our team is available to talk through any queries that may be outstanding beyond the webinars. The other question that we've had at the moment was a query around the approved fee cap term and the approved fee cap category. This is in reference to the two registration categories that there are currently with the OfS. There's approved and approved fee cap, and obviously each of those bring particular benefits, such as access to different categories of student support, but also each category has other elements that either support or enable those benefits. So obviously one of those is approved fee cap, have access to OfS funding, for which HESES is returned, which enables us to calculate and provide a funding allocation to providers. more about the different categories and the requirements and the benefits of each can be found on the OfS website in the registering with the OfS section of the website. So obviously recommend a quick review through there to fill in any gaps that I haven't quite covered here. And we've had a very late question come in regarding if HESES is a count of years of engagement, how does that compare to what is returned in the student record? This will be covered a bit more in the counting webinar to come, but effectively the two are quite closely aligned in terms of counting and the student core sessions and what's returned. But again, come back to the counting webinar and that'll be more fleshed out. Back to you, Roger.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Yes, there's a lot which I can understand might want to be asked at this point, which will, I hope, become apparent as we progress through the series of webinars that we've got. So please don't feel we're trying to avoid the question. It is something which, once you've seen the rest of the series, hopefully that will go most of the way to answering questions that you've got about this or anything else. And if not, as I said, you can always write in and let us know, and we can address your specific queries. So, as Graham was saying, it looks as if we've addressed all of the questions that we've had in, but if you think we've missed something, or if you haven't quite grasped, or you think we haven't quite grasped what you're getting at, then do please follow up with us by writing to the HESES mailbox, heses@officestudents.org.uk, which you can see on the screen there. So I'm just having a final check to see if there are any other questions. I can't see any, so I think we can move on to this final slide and say thank you to everybody for coming today, for attending, and we hope that we see all of you again in a couple of days' time when we go into the next series, next part of our series. And so until then, take care, and we will see you then. Goodbye.